Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to the daily Hindu News Analysis. So let's begin the analysis of today's The Hindu Newspaper by looking at the topics we are going to cover. I have chosen 4 important articles for a detailed discussion, especially from a mains point of view, and we have 4 more articles for our prelims. So before we begin, why don't you support us by pressing the like button, share these videos with other aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Also, head to our Telegram channel because as soon as the session ends, we have a quiz on these topics so that you can revise and practice these articles again. So let's begin with today's discussion by looking at the first article from the front page of the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper. On the front page, the Hindu carries an image where you can see NDRF personnel, that is personnel from the National Disaster Response Force. They are involved in search and rescue operations in Himachal Pradesh following flash floods and landslides which has been triggered by excessive rainfall in Himachal Pradesh. So these disasters are in news. So let's understand this topic in more detail. Let's look at the context, the damage the disasters have caused, and talk about flash floods and landslides from a disaster management perspective. The discussion will be very helpful for geography as well under GS paper 1 and also for disaster management under GS paper 3. According to news reports, in the Kulu-Manali sector of Himachal Pradesh, there have been excessive rains over the last few hours, which has triggered flash floods and landslides all across the region. Many critical highways, including the Chandigarh-Manali National Highway, has been blocked because of the massive landslides, and a lot of deaths and injuries are also being reported. Several people are reportedly missing as well after being trapped in these floods, and hence search and rescue operations have been launched by the National Disaster Response Force. Along with loss of lives being reported, there is also large-scale damage to infrastructure and property which has been reported following these disasters. Hundreds of key roads in the state have been closed. Several power transformers and grids have been affected. So this essentially constitutes a disaster. A disaster is any calamity or catastrophic event where there is large-scale loss of human lives, large-scale injuries to human beings, and as well as serious damage to infrastructure and public property. These disasters can even damage the environment as well. They have an impact on environment and biodiversity as well. So such catastrophic events are referred to as disasters. So it becomes very important to approach disasters from a scientific governance point of view. Disaster management today has become a part of mainstream governance, not just in India but around the world. There is a global framework as well through the UN that deals with disaster risk reduction, which is referred to as the Sendai framework. In India, we have the Disaster Management Act, under which we have set up several institutions and also brought out a policy and a plan to provide for disaster management in India. So given the impact of disasters, how it can lead to large-scale loss of lives, how it can cause serious damage to infrastructure and property, it's very important to focus on disaster management. Because these incidents, they have a disproportionate impact on the vulnerable and the poor sections. The regions affected by such calamities, they will be set back at least by a few years with regard to their development, and it has a huge socio-economic impact as well. Hence, disaster management cannot be seen as an emergency measure, as a temporary ad hoc measure. It should be a part of mainstream day-to-day governance where the focus should be on implementing the disaster management cycle, where we prioritize pre-disaster preparedness and planning, during disaster response, and post-disaster reconstruction. These stages of disaster management cycle have to be prioritized. So in the current context of the disaster which has happened in Himachal Pradesh, it is essentially a meteorological hazard which has in turn triggered a series of hydrological hazards. See, a hazard is a potential event which could potentially trigger a disaster. For example, a region which is prone to earthquakes, a region prone to landslides or floods, they are already facing the hazard because of the natural factors. If the actual hazard were to turn into reality, and if the population in that area, if they are exposed, if they are vulnerable to the impact of the hazard, then it turns into a disaster. It's like how an earthquake in an uninhabited area will not have any impact. So such an earthquake in an uninhabited area cannot be termed as a disaster. It's only a hazard. But when hazard meets with exposure and vulnerability, that is when you have a habited population in a given area, and if the people there are vulnerable, if the region is vulnerable and if they're exposed to the impact of the hazard, then that turns into a disaster, where you will witness large-scale loss of lives, injuries, damage to critical infrastructure, etc. So in the case of the current disaster which has happened, it is heavy rains which are primarily responsible. Sudden outburst of rains, which is essentially an extreme weather event, is categorized as a meteorological hazard. This meteorological hazard has in turn triggered few secondary tertiary hazards which has caused flash floods and landslides. It is this concept that we need to understand. We need to understand the interconnections between extreme rainfall and other natural factors which can lead to flash floods and landslides. There is a direct connection between flash floods and landslides. In fact, they actually make a vicious cycle where they feed upon each other. So let's understand this in slight detail. If you take the current incident which has happened, it has been triggered by heavy rainfall in the ecologically sensitive Himalayan belt. As you know, the Himalayas are young fold mountains, very unstable in their structure, and also you have these steep valleys where water flows down at a very great velocity. The runoff, surface runoff is very high. So in such a vulnerable region, if heavy rains were to be received, excessive sudden outburst of rain, obviously the surface runoff will increase in the slope areas. The water which is flowing down the slope areas, right, it will pick up velocity as it is flowing down, and the other factors here, the structure of the soil material, the vegetation which is present, the quality of the vegetation, they all play a role in arresting the flow of the water. The surface runoff can be naturally arrested if there is a good vegetation cover, if there are forests, trees, plants and grass. They help in cutting the speed of the water and thus they protect the integrity of the slope. But sometimes if, let's say, the slope is denuded because of deforestation, because of urbanization, the forest areas have been cleared, vegetation has been cleared. So if there is nothing to hold the water back and if the water is flowing down at a very fast rate, it's going to weaken the structure and the integrity of the soil. The soil, the top layer of the soil could get saturated with water. Because of this saturation, the soil structure could become weak and this entire material here, the entire rocky soil material could slide down under the influence of gravity. This sudden shifting of earth material, debris and rock material under the influence of gravity is what is known as a landslide. It's also referred to by different names. It's also called a mudslide, landslip, or if only rocky material is sliding down, it's also called a rock avalanche. If the same happens with snow in snow-capped mountainous areas, it's called an avalanche as well. But essentially the phenomena, the dynamics involved here is exactly the same. There could be many factors, many other factors as well which could trigger landslides. Now the problem here is landslides which pushes all the soil and material down into the valley. It will create a natural dam-like structure and it will stop the natural flow of water in the valley areas. It will essentially create a blockage. When a large volume of earth material, soil, rock and vegetation is sliding down in a sudden rapid movement, right, all the debris will get accumulated in the downstream areas in the valley region. This essentially forms a natural temporary dam. A dam-like structure gets formed and the water will start building up behind it. The water will start accumulating. So as the water accumulates, it could put enough stress on the natural dam, and since it's not strong enough, this natural dam could breach within few hours or days, leading to flash floods in the downstream area. And it works the other way around as well. Heavy rains received in such an area, especially in hilly regions, could overwhelm the carrying capacity of the drainage channel. Let's say the river channel and the streams, they are blocked with sediments, and the rainfall is so excessive. Maybe there is a cloud burst, which is another related event. Let's say there is a cloud burst which has occurred, or let's say a glacial lake has melted rapidly and breached to cause a massive flow of water down the stream. Or there could be another possibility where a huge piece of a glacier could rupture and crash into the water below. So any such incident which happens in the higher reaches of a mountainous region could push excessive volume of water, and if this overwhelms the carrying capacity of the drainage channel, that will result in flash floods in the downstream area. The flash floods in turn weaken the soil structure in the slopy area, causing a landslide. The landslides will go on to create multiple natural dams in the downstream area. You can see that in the schematic here. The schematic is representing a scenario where there is a situation where there is heavy rainfall or maybe a cloud burst causing sudden rapid movement of water, and it has triggered landslides, and the debris which is accumulating here blocking the river channel is causing these natural dams to form throughout the downstream area. So as the flow of water continues, as the river channel is getting overwhelmed, it cannot carry the water capacity anymore. These dams could breach and further trigger massive floods in the downstream area. So if these waters, if they breach and enter the habited areas, that is when massive destruction and damage can be reported. Especially in such areas, let's say it's a tourist destination, like we have in Himachal Pradesh or Uttarakhand. A lot of tourists are present, hotels are present, towns and urban areas have been built right on the river bank. Right? So this encroachment because of human activities could further aggravate the impact of the disaster. There will be large-scale damage to property, large-scale loss of lives as well. We have seen many such disastrous events happening in India, specifically in Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Sikkim, and few parts of Northeast India as well. So if you look at flash flood, or in general a flood and its definition, it's a situation where it's a calamity, a catastrophic event, where the flow rate of the water has far exceeded the carrying capacity of the drainage channel, of the river channel. Landslide, as I mentioned, is a sudden slippage, a sudden movement of rock material or debris and other earth material down a slope, where there is one sudden downward movement which could be triggered by heavy rains or even by an earthquake or even by man-made activities. Let's say a lot of construction activities are being taken up in such hilly areas. Heavy earth moving equipment, earth construction equipment are being used, or even explosions are being triggered to build a road or to build a tunnel. So this would have weakened the integrity of the slope, and when there are heavy rains or when there is a sudden flow of water because of cloudburst or glacial lake outburst flood, it's going to weaken the soil integrity and trigger a landslide. So this is how there is a complex relationship between these hazard events. They are interconnected, they form a vicious cycle where one event could trigger the other. And India especially is extremely vulnerable for these events, particularly in the Himalayan belt. I can give you some examples as well to justify this argument. Recently in 2021, there was a major disaster at Chamoli. Some of you might remember this incident, the Chamoli disaster, which was essentially a flash flood. But what triggered the flash flood was the rupture and collapse of a glacial rock that crashed into the water below, triggering a massive tsunami-like flash flood that flooded down the stream in the Rishi Ganga and Dhauli Ganga drainage channels, causing massive devastation in Uttarakhand. An entire power station, hydropower station, was damaged. Several workers, several people were killed in the downstream areas. It was one of the biggest incidents that we had seen in recent times. The trigger here was a landslip-like event where a glacial rock piece had ruptured and crashed into the river stream below, triggering the flash floods in the downstream area. We also had the Kedarnath tragedy in 2013. The massive flash floods in Kedarnath that we saw in 2013. Here again, it was heavy rains accompanied by faster melting of the glaciers that introduced a very large volume of water in the downstream areas of the rivers that caused massive flash floods in Uttarakhand. It was one of the biggest disasters that India had suffered from. So these incidents, which India has frequently witnessed, it shows India's vulnerability for the impact of flash floods and landslides. Now please take a look at the hazard map. This is the hazard map of India with regard to floods, which is provided by the NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority. In this map, you can clearly see the flood-prone areas in India. All the major river basins, be it the Indus Basin, the Gangetic Basin, Brahmaputra Basin, and also in peninsular India, right? The Krishna, Godavari, Kaveri Basin, Mahanadi as well. They're all prone to flooding. But specifically in the Himalayan belt, the risk is much higher. If you look at states like Himachal Pradesh, even Jammu and Kashmir, then Uttarakhand in particular, Sikkim, Northeast India, all these regions are highly prone to the impact of floods. The topography of the Himalayan region here, the terrain, and the ecological damage that has been caused by human activities. Large-scale development, rampant construction activities, deforestation, along with long-term climate change. All these factors are responsible for the increasing frequency of these incidents. It's not just one factor which alone triggers these disasters. It's a combination of all these factors. Now the most interesting point here is that compare this map, the hazard map for floods, with the hazard map for landslides. You're looking at the hazard map for landslides for India. Look at the regions in India which are prone to landslides. The entire Himalayan belt, specifically parts of Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand, parts of Sikkim and Northeast India, along with few parts of Western Ghats. These are the most prone regions in India for landslides. So, rainfall, floods and landslides, they're all interlinked. There is a complex interconnection existing over here. A primary disaster could trigger secondary and tertiary disasters. And of course, there are other factors as well, like an earthquake triggering a landslide, the landslide forming a natural dam, which then could cause a flash flood, right? So you need to understand these complex dynamics which are posing a risk for India's Himalayan belt and also for other areas such as Western Ghats. Kerala as well has been devastated by floods in the last few years. In 2018, 2019, Kerala witnessed massive floods during the monsoon, right? Even there we saw interconnection between heavy rainfall and human activities which has obstructed the flow of the water, which triggers a flood situation causing landslides, and the landslides in turn trigger another flash flood incident, right? So from the examination point of view, you need to understand this complex interplay between various natural and man-made factors that are contributing to these incidents. So that's why I've tried approaching this topic from a conceptual viewpoint. Now let's see what measures can be taken to reduce the disaster risk. Today, with regard to disaster management, the priority is to minimize the disaster risk. Disaster risk reduction is the focus of the Sendai framework adopted by the UN. We have incorporated the same principles, goals and targets into our National Disaster Management Plan and Policy as well. The National Disaster Management Plan and Policy, which has been brought out by the NDMA, incorporates these principles, goals and targets laid down under the Sendai framework. So disaster risk, it arises when there is an interaction between hazard, vulnerability and exposure. When there is an overlap of the hazard with vulnerability and exposure, that is when disaster risk increases. The example that I told you, for example, if you take an earthquake occurring in an uninhabited area, that is just a hazard. If there is no human habitation, no human beings present in that place, no buildings, no construction is present there, the earthquake will virtually have no impact. The shaking of the earth's surface will not cause any kind of damage if there are no buildings and no human population. So without vulnerability, without exposure, the hazard will remain just as a hazard. It will not turn into a catastrophic disaster. Hazard will cause a catastrophic disaster when there is vulnerability and exposure present. In the region where hazard is present, if the people are exposed, if there is vulnerability, that is, let's say the buildings are not following the building standards. Let's say there is encroachment of human habitation into riverbeds. That is when the hazard turns into a disaster. Earthquake hitting a city which is not prepared, right? The city is vulnerable because they haven't followed the building codes. And the people are exposed here. There is a very dense population in an earthquake prone area. So if the hazard occurs, because of vulnerability and exposure, the disaster risk will be very high. The same with the case of floods and landslides. Now imagine a flood occurring in an uninhabited area. It will not have much of an impact on human lives or even on human infrastructure, right? Maybe there will be some environmental damage, that's it. But imagine a scenario where human habitations have been built right next to river banks, or we have encroached on the riverbed and built towns and cities on the drainage channel itself, which means we have exposed ourselves and created vulnerability. So when these overlap, that is when the disaster risk is at the maximum. But the best part is disaster risk can be managed. Through proper planning, preparedness, we can prevent and mitigate few disasters, and this is where we should focus on implementing the DM cycle, the disaster management cycle. Instead of approaching disaster management as a one-time ad hoc event, as an emergency response event, you should think of disaster management as a long-term strategy which requires day-to-day efforts in governance and administration. So in disaster management cycle, there are 3 phases. You have the pre-disaster phase where you prepare, you plan, and through preparedness and planning, you try to prevent or mitigate a disaster. And during disaster, when the disaster has occurred, you improve your response. Through better preparedness and planning, you provide for better emergency relief, provide for effective search and rescue operations, provide for essential medical relief and food supply, shelter, etc. to the affected population. Then after the disaster, focus on long-term recovery, focus on reconstruction, and ensure that you rebuild the economy and the livelihoods which have been destroyed in the long run. So when you have such a comprehensive, holistic look towards disaster management, you can contain and manage the disaster risk. It becomes much more easier and feasible to reduce the loss of lives and as well as reduce the damage to infrastructure and contain the socio-economic impact of a disaster. So with regard to floods and landslides, what can we do? If you think about this from the perspective of the DM cycle, in the pre-disaster phase, you focus on risk analysis. You identify the areas which are most prone, create a hazard vulnerability map, put in place forecasting and early warning systems. Through the right technology, today you can forecast these incidents even before they happen. With a mix of satellite technology and other ground-based sensors, we have the ability to provide forecasting and early warning, which can generate real-time alerts. So we have IMD, India Meteorological Department, which can give alerts for heavy rains, cloudburst events. We have the Geological Survey of India as the nodal authority for mapping out the landslide prone areas in India. It can specifically identify as to which areas are more prone and which specific regions at the local level needs more attention as far as landslide risk is concerned. We have the Central Water Commission, which is the nodal agency for flood alerts. So these authorities, if they make the right investments in the right forecasting technology, we can provide for early warning. This might give a short window of few minutes, maybe few hours to evacuate the people on time. Then you can take few structural measures to divert the flood water, to reduce the surface runoff, maybe through afforestation, for example. If an area has been deforested, that's a risk. It has increased the vulnerability. So take up afforestation measures or build small dams and embankments to divert the flood water, and you can also create structural barriers to hold back the landslide material. Concrete walls can be built to reinforce the slope areas, and even if there is a slippage of the earth material, it can be held back within a given area without affecting the population present in the downstream area. Such structural measures can be taken. And also through long-term planning, you can create zonation maps, identify the high-risk areas where you implement your zoning standards. You regulate the land use pattern. In the most high-risk areas, you prohibit any kind of construction activity, prohibit human settlements in the high-risk areas through land use regulation and zoning and planning. That's another measure which can easily help in mitigating or even preventing the entire disaster. Also protect your natural buffers, protecting the drainage channel, clearing the sediments, protecting the wetlands, because they all act as natural buffers, natural sinks, which can absorb the excess flood water and thereby limit the damage caused. So a lot of such measures can be taken along with long-term climate action measures to deal with global warming and climate change, which is also contributing to these incidents. So such a holistic response will be needed, and that is why the disaster management cycle is extremely important. Got it? So I hope you have completely understood this topic. It's a very, very important topic under geography and also under disaster management. Now moving on, we have another important article, a column on page number 6, that refers to the proposed Digital India Bill. The Ministry of Electronics and IT has proposed the Digital India Bill, which will be a comprehensive legislation that will cover the entire spectrum of electronic commerce, information technologies, cyber crimes, etc. Currently, the legislation that we have to regulate these areas is the IT Act of 2000, the Information Technology Act of 2000. But this law of India is outdated. It's been 23 years since it was enacted by the Parliament, even though it has been amended a few times to keep it up to date. Still, there are many flaws and shortcomings in the IT Act. So to provide for a modern legislation that accounts for all modern IT and technological platforms and the risks and concerns and security threats emerging from them, we need a new legislation in India. In fact, from many years, there has been a debate going on within the government, within the civil society as well, and even within the industry, that the IT Act is no longer sufficient. It's not efficient enough. It's out of date. It's not in line with global standards and practices. So that is why there has been a push for a comprehensive new bill that governs all digital technologies. This includes your social media platforms, any IT platform, including e-commerce platforms. So this is where concerns were raised with regard to the previous provisions under the IT Act. Because see, with regard to the world of information technology, there are a number of concerns and risks that come up. One big concern is about fake news and misinformation, especially on social media platforms. The spread of fake news and misinformation could become a huge security threat because propaganda campaigns, social engineering campaigns on social media can trigger real-world security threats. Through a well-planned fake news and propaganda campaign, which includes misinformation, it is possible to trigger riots, it is possible to manipulate elections, and even trigger civil war conditions in a country. There are many real examples to prove that. So there are major security risks emerging from misuse of social media and internet-based platforms. So there is one concern regarding this which has to be dealt with, which means you have to regulate some internet-based platforms and social media platforms. There's also the risk of competition being harmed by few companies, by few big tech companies which have a dominant position in the IT market. For example, if you look at operating systems, there are few Western companies which dominate the segment. Like Microsoft dominates with its Windows operating system. Apple dominates with the Mac operating system. Google with its Android. So these companies which dominate the IT market, they can favor their own products. They can promote their own products and services and deliberately discriminate against other competitors, thereby creating an unfair playing field. This leads to the rise of monopolies, which could harm the customers from a price point of view and also from an experience and customer satisfaction point of view. Even if you look at e-commerce platforms, few platforms like Amazon, if you look at OTT platforms like Netflix or Amazon Prime, many of these big companies, the big tech companies, they have a dominant position which they can potentially misuse to only promote their products and services. This is anti-competition. This is against competition laws. So there are a lot of concerns, risks and threats emerging from IT-based platforms. Hence, there is a need to regulate them. But the problem was the previous IT Act, the current IT Act that we have, right? It's not sufficient. It's out of date. It does not account for several modern technologies because technology evolves at a rapid pace, and IT Act was brought out in 2000 with few amendments done here and there. So because of the concerns raised by the government entities and by the industry, the government is thinking of replacing it with Digital India Bill. It's thinking of coming out with a new categorization of digital intermediaries so that we can classify and separate different classes of IT platforms. A separate categorization for e-commerce, separate categorization for social media companies, separate categorization for search engines, operating systems, etc., etc. So in this context, first we should understand what provisions were contained in the IT Act, because there can be a potential mains question here asking you to evaluate the relevance of the IT Act, what are the concerns with it, and why Digital India Bill is needed to replace it. On these lines, you can expect a mains question. So to answer such a question, first you should know the provisions of IT Act and the problems and shortcomings associated with it. Then we will compare with few global standards and maybe we can recommend what can be done with the proposed Digital India Bill. Right now, the Ministry of Electronics and IT has said in a few weeks, Digital India Bill, the draft will be ready. It will be placed in the public domain to invite feedback. And after all discussions, a draft bill will be introduced in the parliament. Hopefully, within few months or maybe by next year, we will have a Digital India Act, which is going to replace the IT Act. But first, we should know why IT Act is problematic. The IT Act currently is the primary law in India regulating cyber crimes and the entire IT domain, including all forms of electronic commerce. When I say electronic commerce, I'm referring to all types of electronic transactions, which include sending a mail or posting something on social media or ordering something on an e-commerce platform, right? Or watching content on an internet-based platform. Any such electronic transaction between devices on the internet is electronic commerce. So all forms of electronic commerce, including cyber crimes which are committed in this domain, are regulated by the IT Act. This law of India is based on the UN Citral model. It's based on the UN model law on electronic commerce brought out in 1996, which was recommended by the UN General Assembly. Because by 1990s, around the world, computing and internet was being widely adopted. Internet was already making a transformational difference in almost every sector. So given the risks that were emerging from the internet and IT-based platforms, the UN came out with a model law which countries could follow if they wanted. So India drew some inspiration from the UN Citral model, and along with customized provisions for the Indian context, the IT Act was enacted by the Parliament. Under this law, one of the most important provisions is that when dealing with cyber crimes, even a foreign national can be charged. This is a very, very important provision because in the cyberspace, there are no geographical boundaries, right? The attacker could be sitting in any country or masking their location by using proxy servers and virtual private networks, routing their location through multiple different countries and then mounting a cyber attack against India or carrying out cyber crimes on Indian users. So since it's very difficult to attribute where the attack is coming from, and since foreign elements could be involved, it's very important for the law to recognize this transnational nature of cyber crimes. And India's IT Act does that. It provides for charging anonymous foreign entities and individuals who could be involved in cyber crimes against Indian users or against Indian cyberspace. It also creates a legal framework for electronic governance or e-governance in the country, to provide delivery of government services through electronic methods, through online internet-based platforms. It gave legal validity and recognition for e-governance and recognized electronic records and digital signatures. Today, your electronic documents, right, they have legal validity because of the IT Act. It has legally recognized all kinds of electronic documents. It also gave legal recognition for digital signatures, which helps in authenticating documents, official documents. Is that clear? So the IT Act also established the controller of certifying authorities to issue and regulate digital signatures for various institutions in the country, through which documents and transactions could be authenticated by using unique digital signatures. It also established a cyber appellate tribunal to resolve disputes, because in the cyber domain, to resolve disputes, you need a certain degree of specialization, which the regular judiciary may not be able to take up. You also need to fast track the cases, right? The judiciary is already overburdened. So separate cyber tribunals and appellate tribunals have been set up, and also other old laws were amended through the IT Act to account for the new technologies which had emerged. Since online banking, internet banking was coming up, then cyber forensics was being used in solving crimes, in investigating cases. Several old laws, especially colonial era laws, had to be amended, such as the Indian Penal Code, Indian Evidence Act, Bankers Book Evidence Act, RBI Act, etc. All these other related legislations were amended through IT Act to account for the new technologies, to give recognition for cyber forensics, for net banking, etc. In 2008, the law was amended to add new forms of cyber crimes that were emerging, which included video voyeurism, cyber terrorism, e-commerce frauds, breach of confidentiality, stealing of personal data, and even circulation of child pornography on internet-based platforms. All such new emerging crimes were added and covered under the IT Act. So on the face of it, the law looks to be great, it looks to be sufficient enough to deal with all the challenges. But however, there are serious problems and shortcomings under it. For example, the IT Act had and still has many controversial provisions, such as the Section 66A, which had become highly controversial. Section 66A of the IT Act dealt with offensive messages being sent through communication platforms. But the definition was so broad that it gave discretion to the police and the law enforcement agencies to determine what constitutes offensive. So by misusing this provision, the police, they started filing numerous cases across the country where innocent people, just because they posted something against a government leader, a politician, or a government official, they would arrest them for sending the so-called offensive messages, for sharing a WhatsApp forward, for putting something on Facebook, for sharing a cartoon which is making fun of a political leader, right? These are basically your fundamental rights under Article 19. It's a part of your right to free speech and expression. So these fundamental rights were being conveniently curbed by the political parties, by the ruling parties especially, by misusing the police and law enforcement agencies. Essentially, criticism, dissent against the government was being targeted by misusing such provisions. So in a landmark case, the Supreme Court of India struck down this provision as unconstitutional. In a very important judgment, the Supreme Court declared Section 66A as a draconian provision which violates your right to free speech under Article 19. And it declared that this provision is unconstitutional, and right now Section 66A has been removed from the IT Act. Now I want you guys to figure out which case was this. It's a landmark case. Figure out this judgment was passed in which case, the name of the case, and mention that in the comment section below. Now, recently there was a big development with regard to IT Act. In 2021, new set of IT rules were notified that will apply for intermediaries. Intermediaries are those companies or institutions or entities that are present between the user and the internet. This could be your social media companies, OTT platforms, digital media platforms, or even government entities as well. They are referred to as intermediaries who are present in between the user and the internet. So to regulate a few intermediaries like social media platforms, OTT platforms, digital media platforms, a new set of rules was brought out called IT Rules 2021, which replaced the IT Rules of 2011. Got it? It was brought out under Section 87, Clause 2 of the IT Act to regulate the challenges that were emerging from social media, digital media, and OTT platforms. On social media platforms, a number of strict regulations were placed. For example, if there is a harmful message which is circulating, which is causing law and order problems, leading to security problems in the country, if police and law enforcement agencies approach social media firms, they have to cooperate. They have to take down such content. They have to help identify the originator of the message. So these regulations, restrictions were placed on social media companies along with their own obligations. They have to appoint a grievance redressal officer where people can raise complaints, report any harmful message. They should conduct a thorough review of the message and take down such harmful content which is against the law, which is violating the law and threatening the security of the country. If they receive requests, legal requests from the police and law enforcement agencies, they are bound to cooperate within a time frame, within a given deadline. They have to coordinate with the police and law enforcement agencies to take down such harmful content and even trace the originator of the message. Such strict restrictions were placed on social media firms, whereas for OTT platforms and digital news media, self-regulation was promoted. Is that clear? Since OTT platforms represent creative expression and digital media represents the press, the media in essential, these were provided with self-regulatory measures under IT rules. Instead of government enforcing the regulations, self-regulation within the company, within the industry was widely promoted through the new IT rules. Under the same rules, the government has also included online gaming, which is posing a number of security risks. There is also a proposal to bring in online betting apps as well under these regulations. But here as well, there has been a criticism. The criticism is that some of the regulations are extremely strict. It imposes an unnecessary cost on certain companies, especially smaller companies, which may not be able to make these changes. This could affect their business model. It could increase their cost of operations. And the other fear is that the government could misuse these powers to force social media companies to reveal data, user data, which is a breach of your data privacy and data security. And as you know, data privacy is a fundamental right under Article 21 as part of your right to life. Again, the Supreme Court in the KS Puttaswamy case had ruled that right to privacy is a fundamental right, and that includes data privacy as well. So the fear of government forcing social media companies to reveal user data is a serious risk to your fundamental rights. The government can misuse the power to target critics and opponents, and this represents a very serious risk. So there are a lot of controversies surrounding the IT rules as well. So to address all these issues, that is the reason why the government is thinking of a new bill, a Digital India bill that will holistically cover the entire IT sector and which could replace the IT Act. The current law is seen as untenable. Several experts criticize the IT Act because it defines the intermediaries with a very broad definition. Any institution, any entity between the user and the internet is classified as an intermediary. And on all intermediaries, the same kind of regulations are placed. Currently, there are three main categories of intermediaries under the IT rules. You have social media intermediaries, which are small social media firms, which have few thousand or maybe few lakh subscribers. These are essentially smaller platforms. Then you have significant social media intermediaries, which have millions of subscribers with global operations, like Facebook, Twitter, Telegram, YouTube, etc. Then you have online gaming intermediaries. So currently under the IT rules, three such classes of intermediaries have been identified. But the problem is, within the social media and significant social media category, there is a broad definition for everyone. It will include matrimonial sites. It will include social networking sites. It's going to include even e-commerce platforms under it as well. So without classifying the IT products and platforms based on the services they are offering, based on the method in which the platform has been designed, right? The government is imposing a disproportionate regulation on the companies. You can't expect a small social media firm to take up stringent measures just like a large social media firm would be expected, right? You have to keep the cost into account, and the increased cost and the increased obligations could hurt the business of the company itself, thereby destroying the whole industry. Also, the fear is the strict restrictions on them and obligations on them could impair their operations, because almost every entity has been clubbed under the same category. There is no distinction between websites, internet service providers, genuine social media platforms and e-commerce platforms. All IT platforms are grouped and clubbed under few categories. So this Inefficient categorization is the core of the problem. Now, let me give you an example. You'll understand this better. Now, take a platform like, let's say, Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Zoho. These platforms, they have a very limited closed user base. They're not open to millions and millions of people at the same time. These are closed groups where few people are using these platforms, and usually through a paid subscription. There are other platforms like WhatsApp or let's say Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc., which have millions and millions of subscribers, and these are more open platforms. Now it is wrong essentially to place both the platforms on the same level, because let's say there is a harmful message, a harmful viral message. The chances of such a message going viral on open social media platforms is more as compared to on platforms like Microsoft Teams or Zoom. Correct? Let's say there is a rumor which has been created by few vested elements. They want to create law and order problem in the country by spreading a rumor. They want to trigger communal riots, for example. This fake message, which might circulate on closed platforms, will never go viral. It will only reach a limited audience. How can you expect those companies to follow the same restrictions and regulations as open social media platforms like, let's say, Facebook or YouTube or Instagram, where the message could actually go viral and could have a real world impact? So that is why a distinction has to be made between different types of intermediaries. Depending on their user base, depending on their model, depending on their technology and what purpose the platform is serving, right? You need to classify and categorize different IT platforms. You can't simply treat everyone as an intermediary and place the same restrictions on all of them. This will be disproportionate regulation. By treating all intermediaries under the same category, you are simply increasing their cost of doing business. You are placing more liability on smaller companies, even though they are not posing a risk to the security of the internet and the security of the state. This is why a distinction has to be made. Now look at the global standards here. The best standard to compare with would be European Union's Digital Services Act. When it comes to these laws, be it data protection, digital services, or even artificial intelligence and cryptocurrencies, with regard to all these IT and platforms and emerging technologies, European Union is miles ahead of any other country or jurisdiction. They have already brought out the best possible laws in this domain. The Digital Services Act provides for clear classification of IT platforms and services, and accordingly obligations and regulations are placed on them. The Digital Services Act of European Union makes a distinction between search engines, e-commerce platforms, social media platforms, etc. When it comes to search engines, the concern is about any threat to competition. The same with e-commerce platforms. The concern is platforms like, let's say, Amazon or Google, right? They might rank their own products at the top of the page, thereby misleading the users to buy only their products and services by discouraging their competition. This is against competition. So for them, the regulation has to be different. But for platforms like Facebook or Instagram or YouTube, where the risk is about security because of fake news, the regulations on them has to be different. You can't have the same regulations. So such categorization is needed, and the European Union has done that. Same with Australia. Australia has brought out a similar law where IT platforms are categorized into 8 classes. There is an 8-fold classification of different groups, and each of them are placed under a different set of regulations and obligations. This is exactly what India is also hoping to do. The Digital India Bill, which has been proposed, is aiming to bring out such a classification of different platforms, and accordingly, based on their risks, a different set of regulation will be placed on them, which will be proportional and fair to the companies as well. It will be more effective to deal with the risks for our security and for competition, fair competition. All right. So this is the point I wanted to make, and the topic is extremely important for polity and also for internal security. Moving on, we have an article on page number 1 and 10 that refers to the crisis in Manipur and specifically focuses on the suspension of operations agreement which the government of Manipur had signed with various Kuki insurgent outfits. This is the topic in news. According to the article, Chief Minister of Manipur Biren Singh has said that the central government, the Ministry of Home Affairs, is going to ensure that the suspension of operations agreement which was worked out in 2008 will be upheld by the government. Because recently the state government of Manipur had withdrawn from the suspension of operations agreement against Kuki insurgent outfits. It was one of the prime reasons which triggered some of the Kuki insurgents, and it played a big role in the ethnic violence which has eventually hit the state. As you know, Manipur is still burning. The situation has still not been stabilized and normalcy hasn't returned to Manipur. The entire ethnic violence that has been witnessed is a result of the deep ethnic divide between the Meitei community, the Meitei ethnic group, found in the valley, found in the Imphal valley of Manipur. Right? Meiteis are the most dominant class in Manipur. They belong to the Meitei royal kingdom of the Manipur princely state. And even in terms of their population, right, and in terms of their political economic influence, Meiteis are much more dominant. Whereas the Imphal valley is surrounded by the hills. All across the state, all around the state, you have these hill areas where you find other minor tribes such as Nagas and Kukis. Many experts, they actually compare Manipur's geography with that of a cricket stadium or a football stadium. It's like you have a center field, which is the valley here, the Imphal valley, and around that you have these stands rising above, which is nothing but the hill areas of Manipur. That is how the geography of Manipur is. It's very unique. In the valley areas, in the Imphal region, you have the Meiteis, who are the dominant class, and in the hill areas, you have Nagas, Kukis and other tribes, which are the hill-dwelling tribes. Post-independence, there has been a rivalry between these communities. Especially Nagas and Kukis were given the ST status. They were recognized as scheduled hill tribes, which meant they got a lot of privileges, right, in terms of reservation, government benefits, and more importantly, their land got protection. The tribal land in the hill areas here, for example, in districts like Churchandpur, which is a stronghold of the Kuki community, Kuki land is protected. Meiteis from the valley cannot come to hill areas and purchase their land. Whereas Meiteis were never given any such status because of their dominant status. So the socio-economic divide between these communities was always present. Plus, Nagas and Kukis had their own insurgencies going on in the region. The Naga insurgency from neighboring Nagaland was a support, armed support for the hill Nagas in Manipur. So Meiteis always felt threatened that the integrity of the state is under risk, because if Naga insurgents manage to break away the areas to form their so-called Greater Naga Limb, to unite all the Naga inhabited areas, it could threaten the integrity of Manipur itself. Kukis also, who had a support base in Mizoram and in Myanmar as well, because they are connected with other ethnic groups like the Chins in Myanmar. They're also connected to Mizos in Mizoram. So all these groups had their own insurgencies going on. There were at least 30 different Kuki insurgent groups trying to form a Kuki land as a separate country from India. So as these armed groups were present, the Meiteis who felt threatened, who felt discriminated as well, they started their own insurgency back in 1960s itself. Meiteis set up their own insurgent groups like UNLF, United National Liberation Front, the People's Liberation Army, etc., to fight against the Naga insurgents and Kuki insurgents. So throughout 1960s, 70s, 80s, the state had seen a lot of destabilization, and to contain the insurgency, the government had imposed AFSPA, the controversial Armed Forces Special Powers Act, to give special powers to the Indian Army and Assam Rifles to carry out counter-insurgency operations. Over the last 30 years, the violence had been contained. By 1990s, the violence had gone down. Even though the ethnic divisions were still present, at least as of early 2000, 2015, tensions were pretty normal, and Manipur had been more or less stabilized. But in the last few months, there have been some very serious developments. On one hand, Myanmar has been going through a crisis. Because of the crisis in Myanmar, refugees have flown into Mizoram and Manipur, and the Chins in particular, who are related to the Kukis, have entered Manipur as refugees. they started settling down in the forested areas of Manipur and Mizoram with the support of Kuki insurgent groups. Allegedly, they have cleared the forest land for illegal encroachment by the Chin refugees, and apparently, according to these allegations, they have started growing drugs to sustain their movement, especially to fund their insurgent movement as well. Based on these accusations, the government of Manipur, which was seen to be on the side of the Meiteis, it suspended the ceasefire which was agreed to with the Kuki outfits. As Kuki insurgency had been contained in the last few years, back in 2008, a suspension of operations agreement had been worked out between Government of India, various Kuki insurgent groups and the state government of Manipur. This was in 2008. In 2008, a ceasefire was established and a suspension of operations agreement had been signed. But now recently, just few months before, in March 2023, the state government of Manipur alleged that Kuki groups are arming themselves. They are breaking the ceasefire agreement and they are clearing the forest land with Chin refugees and trying to grow drugs in the region, which is a threat to the security of the state. So through these allegations, the state government suspended the ceasefire and withdrew from the suspension of operations agreement, which meant security forces would now target the Kuki outfits. So as Kukis felt threatened, tensions started rising. And parallelly, there was a High Court judgment which ruled that Meiteis should also be provided scheduled tribe status. The Meitei community has been fighting for ST status from a long time. There was a committee recommendation. The Ministry of Tribal Affairs back in 2013 had recommended ST status to the Meiteis. But the proposal had been held back because of the controversial nature of the issue. But recently the court stepped in and said that ST status has to be provided to the Meiteis as well. So this triggered a counter opposition by the Kukis, which led to clashes between the armed groups of both the sides, between Meiteis and the Kukis. So all these events are interlinked. The ethnic divisions, the previous insurgency, the deep ethnic divides here, right? They're all interconnected. So suspension of the ceasefire agreement by the government of Manipur was one of the key triggers. Under this suspension of operations agreement, around 25 various Kuki groups that had come together to form Kuki National Organization. In total, there were at least 30 different Kuki insurgent groups fighting for so-called Kuki land. At least 25 of them had agreed for a ceasefire and 17 of them were part of this group called Kuki National Organization. And there are a few other minor groups as well. All these Kuki outfits had agreed for a ceasefire and a suspension of operations agreement back in 2008. Based on the ceasefire, a peace process had begun. Peace talks were actually going on, which was led by former Chief of RAW, A.B. Mathur, the former Special Secretary of Research Analysis Wing, which is India's foreign intelligence agency, right? A.B. Mathur had been appointed as the envoy to lead the talks with Kuki groups to work out a peaceful agreement through which we can provide autonomy to Kuki territorial areas. Instead of continuing the insurgent war and the counter operations and further escalating the violence, the government had worked out a ceasefire and started a peace process back in 2008. Accordingly, talks were going on to provide some limited autonomy to the Kuki areas so Kuki Land Territorial Council can be formed. This would mean delegation of few administrative, legislative, financial powers. But the suspension of the agreement is what instigated the Kuki groups. The recent suspension with the government of Manipur caused a lot of concern. Because see, according to the agreement, according to the suspension of operations agreement, the Kuki insurgents, they were supposed to surrender their weapons and keep them locked with a double locking system in security camps which are guarded by their own groups and as well as monitored by the Indian forces. In designated camps, the insurgents have to lock away all the weapons with a double locking system for which they will also have access. The insurgents will also have access to the rooms and security forces will also have access to it. It can be opened only with the double locking system. Regularly, Indian forces will monitor whether the weapons are locked away as promised. They should not engage in any violence. They should not carry out any insurgent attacks or involve in crime, involve in extortion, etc. They have to basically end all their illicit activities and simply engage in talks with the government. Meanwhile, the surrender of weapons, which is locked away in these camps, will be monitored by the security forces. And to support the insurgents, some financial support was also promised. A stipend was promised with some other financial assistance. So till the peace talks could be worked out and a peace agreement can be finalized, the Kuki insurgents will keep getting some financial support from the state. This was the tripartite agreement between Kuki insurgents, Government of Manipur and Government of India. But recently the Government of Manipur suspended its end of the deal. It withdrew from the agreement by alleging that Kukis were arming themselves. They were breaching the agreement and engaging in criminal activities again by deforesting the area, by encroaching forest land to cultivate drugs and smuggle arms and weapons from across the border in Myanmar. By making these allegations, Government of Manipur withdraw from the suspension of operations agreement, which played a critical role in triggering the violence. So now, to contain the crisis which has broken out, the Home Ministry, Central Home Ministry has promised to uphold the ceasefire again, provided if the Kukis also agree to their terms. If the Kukis also uphold their end of the deal, the Ministry of Home Affairs has promised and the state government also has agreed to replace the ceasefire back and ensure that we continue under the suspension of operations agreement. This could play a big role in containing the violence. It could hold back the Kuki insurgents and return some of the arms and weapons to the camps, right? It would give more flexibility for the Indian forces as well to easily contain the situation. The other challenge here is that in the Imphal Valley region, in few districts, AFSPA had been removed previously. Because of the improved security situation over the years, AFSPA had been removed. And now Indian forces are complaining that without AFSPA, their operational capabilities are limited. So as a result, Methi armed groups are operating freely. They are freely carrying out attacks and indulging in violence because AFSPA has been lifted in some of the districts of Imphal. So Indian forces are urging for bringing AFSPA back in the valley areas as well. Right now, AFSPA is implemented only in some of the hill areas, which applies for Naga and Kuki inhabited areas. But Methi groups are more free to operate and even engage in violence, as Indian forces are not able to use complete force against them to tackle the violence. So that's another major issue. And the other concern which has come up is the role of women protesters. Remember, yesterday we spoke about a group called Meera Paibis. This social group led by the women of Manipur, they have been obstructing ongoing operations. They've been blocking off Indian Army convoys, trying to prevent security operations. So these are the various challenges which have come up to contain the situation. That's why the Prime Minister, as soon as he came back from Egypt, he has held a high-level meeting with all the stakeholders to come out with an immediate solution to stabilize Manipur and bring normalcy back to Manipur. Next, the fourth article, it's related to Sri Lanka's economic crisis. We have to take a look at some recent developments as far as Sri Lanka's debt problem is concerned, because we have an article on page number 13. As you know, last year, Sri Lanka's economy collapsed under the debt burden, which was caused by both the external debt and the domestic debt. Sri Lanka had borrowed heavily from the global markets, through the bond markets, also from international financial institutions like World Bank, IMF, and from bilateral lenders as well, like India, China, Japan, etc. Sri Lanka reached a stage where it was no longer able to service these loans, and it stopped paying back these loans as its foreign exchange reserves had crashed. Its domestic economy had collapsed, its agriculture, tourism had suffered because of various factors, and as a result, Sri Lanka ran out of forex reserves, triggering this economic collapse of Sri Lanka. Imports were halted, essential supplies became in short supply, triggering massive inflation as well. Along with that, there was a meltdown of the domestic economy. Domestically as well, within Sri Lanka, the debt burden started rising, where many borrowers, they couldn't repay the loans because of the collapsed economy of Sri Lanka. So to overcome this debt burden, the external and internal debt burden, Sri Lanka has approached many countries for help. It has asked India for help, Japan for help, China for help. It has also approached the IMF. It has approached multilateral institutions like IMF, and it has secured a bailout package of $3 billion. But the problem with taking support from IMF is that IMF support is always conditional. IMF places few conditions Only if the country fulfills them will the bailout package be delivered. India is a victim of this. India, when we suffered a BOP crisis in 91-92, when India took help from the IMF, a lot of conditions were placed on India, which includes devaluing your currency, reducing your debt burden, restructuring the debt, and opening up your economy for foreign investment, foreign competition. Right? This could hurt your domestic interests. So that is the downside of taking help from the IMF. But Sri Lanka right now has no other choice. So it is taking a 3 billion bailout package. And according to the agreement, it has to restructure both its foreign and internal debt. Currently, its foreign debt stands at around $41 billion and domestic debt stands at around $42 billion. This is a massive sum for a small country like Sri Lanka. So to restructure the debt, Sri Lanka is negotiating with all the lenders. As far as its external debt is concerned, it's negotiating with the bilateral creditors. That includes around 17 countries. This group of creditors are led by India, Japan and France. India, Japan are some of the biggest lenders to Sri Lanka. So we are working with the Paris Club of Creditors. The Paris Club is an international group, a group of countries which provide loans to other countries. These are the creditor nations. Alright, usually it's the developed countries which are there in the list, in the Paris Club. So whenever a country is not able to service the loan, the borrowing country, if it's not able to meet the obligation, then the Paris Club will restructure the loan. The Paris Club of creditor countries, they will restructure the loan so that the borrowing country will get some breathing space to repay the loan without suffering an economic collapse. So right now, Paris Club of Creditors, along with India, Japan, France and few others, are bilaterally negotiating with Sri Lanka to restructure its external debt. However, China has been creating problems. China has not officially joined these bilateral creditor negotiations. It's only observing as an observer. China's argument is that multilateral creditors have to be brought in to the negotiation, which means Sri Lanka's lenders, who could be multilateral institutions, right? It could be World Bank or it could be funds raised through the bond markets, through sovereign funds, right? All those creditors also should be brought into the negotiations according to China. But this will be very complicated. It will further increase the burden on Sri Lanka. Currently, the approach is that bilateral creditors will negotiate and restructure the debt. Then multilateral creditors can negotiate an arrangement. But China is pushing for multilateral creditors negotiations, which is opposed by every other country, including India. It appears that China is deliberately creating the problem to gain leverage over Sri Lanka, right? So Sri Lanka is desperately trying with all the countries, with India, with China, with Japan, to convince everyone to come on board so that the external debt can be restructured as soon as possible. That is one part of the challenge Sri Lanka is facing. The other concern right now is the domestic debt. The Sri Lankan government has announced a restructuring plan. Very soon it will be tabled in the Sri Lankan parliament. And according to reports, for few days, Sri Lanka's bank and financial system will be closed entirely. Unprecedented steps will be taken. Banking and financial functions will be stopped, completely halted for 5 days or maybe 7 days, which will give time to restructure some of the funds and loans present within the Sri Lankan banking system. Now, the concern here is that if such restructuring is done internally, this could affect the savings of people, their retirement funds, etc. The money people have deposited in their savings account, their pension funds, provident fund, everything could take a hit. Interest rates could be altered because these are emergency provisions that Sri Lanka is implementing. It's going through a financial emergency and it will bleed the people of Sri Lanka. It will have a huge impact on them. So this proposed restructuring plan has caused a lot of concern among Sri Lankans about how it's going to affect their savings, their deposits and their retirement benefits. Alright, so it's a developing story. Let's wait and watch how things will develop in the coming days. So this completes my detailed discussion of all the big articles. Now we'll quickly go through the prelims related articles. On page number 6, we have an editorial that refers to India-Egypt relations, which we covered yesterday in detail. So of course, I'll not be repeating the same topic. But the editorial is making a reference to the New Development Bank and Egypt's membership of the New Development Bank. So I thought we'll have a small discussion on the New Development Bank, which can be very important for your prelims. The NDB, it's a banking institution set up by the BRICS grouping. That is by Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. The BRICS group of countries, they have challenged the global financial system, which is dominated by IMF and World Bank. These multilateral financial institutions are currently dominated by Western countries such as US and European Union. So BRICS countries have tried to create an alternative for the IMF and the World Bank, and one of the initiatives they took up was the establishment of the NDB, the New Development Bank. This is seen as a counter to the World Bank. Just like the World Bank, the NDB is designed to provide loans, investments and funds to the member countries and other countries to help in developmental projects. So NDB was agreed to at the Fortaleza summit in 2014, at the 6th BRICS summit held in Fortaleza in Brazil. That's when NDB was announced, and it has been set up with headquarters in Shanghai. The unique part about NDB is that here the voting structure is equal, because the shareholding pattern is equal amongst all members. Now this was the biggest problem with World Bank and IMF. The biggest complaint of countries like India, China, South Africa, Brazil, even Russia was that World Bank and IMF, even though other countries are contributing equally, they still have a disproportionate voting share for Western countries. That is how US and European countries dominate IMF and World Bank, because their shareholding is higher, their voting share is also higher. So NDB is built on the model of equality, where every member, every partner is equal, all of them contribute equally, they provide an equal amount of capital, and they get an equal voting share. So that in that regard, NDB is a very unique development and funding organization, and it has already funded billions of dollars worth of projects in several BRICS countries and other countries as well. Now NDB's membership has been opened up. In fact, BRICS itself is looking to expand, and this is a very big development. NDB membership has been expanded in the recent years, and the BRICS membership is also likely to be expanded. In the upcoming BRICS summit, which is likely to be held in August in South Africa at Cape Town, discussions will happen about including new members to BRICS. New members have already been added to the NDB. So that's why a push is being given to add new members to the BRICS as well. So in the NDB, apart from the BRICS countries, other countries like Bangladesh, UAE, Egypt, Uruguay, they've all been admitted into the New Development Bank. Bangladesh and United Arab Emirates joined in 2021. Egypt, which was a prospective member, has recently joined NDB in March 2023. Please remember this. With the support of India and other countries, Egypt joined NDB in March 2023. It signifies the close ties between India and Egypt. Also remember, India is supporting Egypt's entry through the African Union into the G20. Egypt is also supporting UN reforms to help India get a permanent seat. So that is the kind of mutual support they are extending to each other. So as Egypt has already become a NDB member, it is very much likely, very much possible for Egypt to become a member of BRICS as well, if the BRICS is expanded. Right? So these are the key points you need to be familiar with for prelims. Next, we have an article on page 12 that refers to the Char Dham Yatra in Uttarakhand, also called the Chota Char Dham. It's a very popular Hindu pilgrimage, right? Millions of Hindu pilgrims visit these Chota Char Dham sites in Uttarakhand, and it's a very sacred pilgrimage as well. But the pilgrimage route is very risky. The terrain, the climate, the weather is very tough and complicated. So a number of people lose their lives. According to this report from the government of Uttarakhand and the union government, 149 Char Dham Yatris have lost their lives because of diseases, ailments, accidents and disasters. So that is a very big number, right? So that data has been brought out in this article. So the data itself is not relevant for the exam. You should know that pilgrims face a risk because of heightened diseases, ailments and accidents and disasters. But from a prelims point of view, you should be familiar with the Char Dham and Chota Char Dham Yatra. The Chota Char Dham refers to 4 sacred pilgrimage sites within Uttarakhand. They're all present on the banks of the Ganga and its tributaries, It includes Yamunotri, Gangotri, Kedarnath and Badrinath. This circuit completes the Char Dham Yatra in Uttarakhand, also called the Chota Char Dham. There is another nationwide Char Dham Yatra that includes Badrinath in Uttarakhand, Jagannath Puri Temple in Odisha, the Ramnath Swami Temple in Rameshwaram in Tamil Nadu, and the Dwarkadish Temple at Dwarka in Gujarat. This completes the nationwide Char Dham Yatra. So please be familiar with this from art and culture point of view. Next, on the same page, there is an article referring to NHRC, the National Human Rights Commission. So I think NHRC can be a very important statutory body for your prelims because it's part of a syllabus. The article here refers to an exploitative bonded labor system in Maharashtra where 11 workers were tied and tortured by the employer, which is a very serious gross violation of human rights. So NHRC has issued a notice to the government of Maharashtra regarding this incident. So that is the development reported. But the topic for us is NHRC itself. So you should know some basic facts. I've given all the key points. Let me take you through them. The National Human Rights Commission is an independent statutory body established in 1993 through the Protection of Human Rights Act. Is that clear? It's a statutory body established in 93 under this law. The law has been amended in 2006 to give it more powers, and the NHRC, of course, is mainly focused on upholding human rights in the country. This is in line with the commitments India has made to the Paris Principles of 1991 that was adopted by the United Nations, and it's also in line with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted in 1948. Now, India is a signatory to both. India is a signatory to the UDHR and to the Paris Principles. And within our constitution as well, there is a commitment in the preamble, in the fundamental rights, to uphold human rights. Correct? It is implicitly mentioned. It's an implicit inference that you can draw that Indian constitution also is committed with regard to protecting and upholding human rights. Plus, we also have a commitment to the UN Charter, which also talks about upholding of human rights. So to fulfill all these obligations, India established the NHRC by passing the Protection of Human Rights Act in 1993. It's a statutory body. At the state level, you have state human rights commissions. So they have the authority to investigate human rights abuses in the country, issue notices to all the concerned authorities as well. Got it? Now please read about the composition of NHRC. That is an exercise for you. That's a small homework. Read about the composition. Who is the chairperson, who are the members, and post that in the comments below. The last article for today, on page 14 in the economy page, we have a reference to BIS, the Bank for International Settlements. The BIS has expressed concerns about rising inflation. It has mentioned that the current economy is going through an inflection point, a very dangerous point, where inflation levels are extremely high, and it has urged central banks around the world to raise interest rates to contain and bring down the inflation. So you should know what is BIS, what is the Bank for International Settlements. It's essentially an international financial organization which is owned and set up by several central banks around the world. For example, the US Federal Reserve, India's RBI, the European Central Bank, and many other central banks together, they have formed the Bank for International Settlements, which is headquartered at Basel in Switzerland. Its main function is to promote coordination between central banks and stabilize the monetary financial framework of the world. You would have heard about Basel requirements, the Basel norms such as Basel I, Basel II, Basel III, which are capital adequacy requirements to be maintained in the banks to ensure the stability of the banking system. These Basel norms are brought out by the Basel Committee on Bank Supervision, which is a committee under the Bank for International Settlements. India's RBI enforces these Basel norms. We have implemented Basel 1, 2, 3 norms according to the recommendations of the Basel Committee on Bank Supervision, which is one of the committees under the BIS. So these basic facts are very important for prelims for both IR and economy. So this completes my detailed discussion of today's Hindu newspaper. Trust me, with this, you have covered the entire newspaper today, right? You don't have to go back and read the paper again, and I really hope you guys have felt the same. If you like the initiative, press the like button, share more comments, and subscribe to the channel. Also take up these questions for your mains answer writing practice. So that is it for today. I'll see you in the next class. Till then, take care. Have a good day.